Hi there. So I'm an HR consultant and I've got a lot of clients asking about psychological safety. And I thought, gee, it's time to revisit this topic because I'm sure there's been lots of development in the last few years. That's all coming up right now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams. This is the HR Hub. On the show, we talk about anything related to HR. So if that's what you've come to learn about, you're in the right place. I encourage you to subscribe to the show or podcast to keep learning from my guests. Today, my guest is Stephan Wiedner. Again, Stephan is a coach and psychological safety expert. He's also the CEO of a couple companies, Zarango and Noomii. Psychological safety through interpersonal skills is one of his passions, so I'm really glad to have him. Hi, Stephan. How are you?
Hi, Andrea. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay, so I suppose it's not the oddest passion in the world, but how did you become interested in psychological safety?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, in my role at Noomii, we conduct coaching engagements with organizations. And over the years, what I've attempted to do is bring a measured result to the organization. So if they're spending money on coaching, I want to make sure that we can say, hey, yes, we've improved outcomes for your organization and there's a positive ROI there. And so when I came across psychological safety, it just light bulbs went off because I saw it as a means for measuring the impact of coaching, because whether or not the individuals participating in the coaching said it or used that term, ultimately, I think most of them, if not all of them, were wanting to improve psychological safety, because most of the coaching engagements were for leaders, managers, executives, all different levels of the organization. And yet all of them wanted to improve how they communicated with their team. Maybe they explicitly want to improve delegation skills. Maybe they want to improve executive presence, which we talked about last time, etc. So whatever it is that they wanted to do, ultimately they wanted to get more results out of their team. And psychological safety suddenly became this thing we could measure before and after. And I thought, gosh, this is awesome, because if you have two team managers, one who, let's say, is in an engineering environment, one who is in, legal and compliance, their needs are completely different. Their outcomes that they're driving for are completely different. And so without being able to get inside information into how many more widgets they sold or how much more their company is compliant with whatever legal standards, I saw psychological safety as a proxy for high performance, because that's what we know is true. We know psychological safety is it correlates with high performance. So the best teams have high degrees of psychological safety, and conversely, the worst teams tend to have low levels of psychological safety. And so that was really the genesis of my interest in the term psychological safety.
I think we all have notions of what psychological safety is, but can you define that just for clarity's sake?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start, because it's fairly descriptive. And so people, I think, generally draw their own internal conclusions.
Yeah, they do.
They don't, right? If they don't know what it is explicitly. So I'll offer two definitions. The first is Harvard's Amy Edmondson, Dr. Amy Edmondson. She defines it as the belief that within your work environment, you can speak up, you can say what's on your mind, you can even admit mistakes, and you can do all of that without the fear of some sort of social consequence or some sort of reprimand. And an obvious consequence with you speaking up is you get fired. But that's not really what we're talking about. I mean, there are cases where that happens, but it's more subtle than that, and it happens in every conversation all the time. People will refrain from speaking up because they don't want to be perceived as stupid, or they don't want to be perceived as oppositional. Like, gosh, you always seem to have, why can't you just agree with us for once, for goodness sake, right? Yeah. Like that's the social consequence we're talking about. And it's a lot more subtle. And in our brains, we have this dialogue running all the time that says, do people like me? How are people perceiving me? Because we care about how we're perceived in the world.
Yeah.
And then the definition that we use in our training is, so I think, a little bit more actionable and maybe a little less theoretical. So it's the courage to speak up and the confidence to know you'll be heard. So as a leader, you need to create an environment where everybody, not just you, but everybody has the courage to speak up and the confidence to know you'll be heard. So we came up with this definition towards the beginning of the pandemic. And what we noticed is that there were groups of people protesting, right? Black Lives Matter, and they were speaking up. So we correlated psychological safety with speaking up. And yet that wasn't enough, because we were pretty confident that protesters don't feel psychologically safe. They don't feel like their words matter, or that, they feel like they have to yell because otherwise what they have to say, their perspective, is not appreciated. And so that's why we added the second half to the definition. It's not enough to just speak up. Instead, you also need to create an environment where people have the confidence that what they have to say matters and will be heard and appreciated.
Yes, you're talking largely about the social consequences. I feel like I want to ask about something like the dampening effect of, say, discipline. But sometimes that has to happen. Like, you've got some person legitimately harassing somebody else. That also is having a dampening effect on that person's feeling of psychological safety. And sometimes you have to fire them. So how do you balance that?
That's a good question. And I think the way we would approach that, approach any endeavor to improve psychological safety, by measuring it. And when we measure it, what we get is an average score. Okay. And we, as the practitioner, would have insight and knowledge, would publicly share this, because it would be a breach of people's trust in their confidential information. But we can see that maybe you have a group of people who feel awesome. Hey, psychological safety, yeah, A+. And then you have another group of people who feel like they're on the outside and that they can't speak up. And you're going to have everything in between. And so what's valuable with measuring it is what we share with the group is, here's your average score and here's the variability. So if everybody is an 8 out of 10 and the average score is 8 out of 10, well, the variability is very small. We can say with confidence, hey, look, most people on this team feel like psychological safety is about an 8 out of 10. That's good. And then conversely, you might have a group that is an 8 out of 10, but you have 5 people that are 10 out of 10 and a couple of people that are a 4 out of 10. Now you have the same average score. You still have an 8 out of 10, but your variability is much bigger. And so you want to explore that. And you say, okay, sure, maybe we have a good score and not everybody feels the same way in this room. So how can we encourage all voices to be heard? So that becomes a lot more of a skillful conversation to be had when you don't have everybody, feeling the same way.
Yeah, interesting. What's the link? You mentioned it already, but maybe you can elaborate. What is the link between psychological safety and performance?
Yeah, well, there's some really good data there, which indicates that psychological safety is a key factor for high performance teams. Perhaps the best study was done by Google. So Google, they ranked all of their teams. They had 180 teams and they ranked them all from top to bottom. And so they scratched their head and they asked the question, what makes an effective team? And Google, being Google, went about it in a very systematic, data-driven way. And they went around the organization and they asked executives, leaders, managers, everyone. They said, what do you think matters? What matters for an effective team? And they came up with 250 different factors. So they looked at, age, composition, gender, ethnicity, all sorts of things. And nothing correlated. nothing correlated. So they had to go back to the drawing board. And that's when they came across the concept of psychological safety in the academic research. And when they applied that to their data set, it became the number one most important factor correlating with high performance. And so from that, they published their results and they identified 5 factors. Number one being psychological safety. And the belief is that not only is it number one, but it's almost like the gateway for the other 4. So, right, the other 4 are, I'm going from memory here, meaning and purpose. So those are 2 separate things. Do the people within the team feel like they have meaning? The other one is about purpose. Do they feel like their work is purposeful? Does it fit in with the bigger schema? And then is there clarity about what the organization and the team is trying to achieve? And then the other one is dependability. Do we have dependable workers within this team? I see psychological safety again as a gateway for those other 4 things, because I think those other 4 things are much more obviously meaningful and desirable, right? Like, of course I want my team to be dependable, right? Of course I want them to have clarity about what needs to be achieved. And of course I want them to have meaning and purpose within their work. Those things are kind of self-evident. Psychological safety, maybe not so. And yet the hypothesis there is that psychological safety is the gateway for those other 4 things.
Well, I suppose we can all imagine, probably all of us have been on a team that had low psychological safety, but what did that look like for you?
I think we might often think of a place with low psychological safety as one where, people are fighting or they don't get along. There's ultimately a ton of disrespect. And I think that can be the case. And perhaps a much more common scenario that people see, which might be misconstrued as a psychologically safe environment, but really isn't, is one where there's a lot of politeness, where there's a lot of agreeableness, like, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, right away, sir, right away, ma'am, that kind of politeness where we're really trying to maintain social cohesion at the expense of having difficult conversations. So the elephant is in the room, it's rattling around, it's making a lot of noise, and ain't nobody going to talk about it.
It's the elephant in the room. Oh my goodness. And as, you and I are both Canadians, and Canadians are known for being polite. So what's the alternative, the psychologically safe alternative to politeness?
Yeah, I would say it's broadly described as candor. We're big believers in radical candor, the book, and I guess the leadership philosophy of Kim Scott. And we love her work, and I think that's the replacement for politeness, is being able to. And for those who are familiar with Kim Scott's work, she, like many consultants, has a 2x2 grid. and her personal experience is that you want to merge these 2 things that are often perceived as being at opposite ends of the spectrum. And the 2 things are caring personally and then challenging directly. And she came from this place of being, I guess you can say, an abrasive leader, right? She just thought, I need to be firm. I can't demonstrate that I care for my people, otherwise I'm going to be perceived as weak. Right. So I need to be a driver of performance. And what she realized with time and maturity was that you can have both, and you need both. You need to show that you care personally for folks, and you can challenge them directly, because if you do only one or the other, if you only challenge directly, you come across as a jerk. And if you only care personally, you might come across as someone who is too soft or too weak, or, isn't pushing for enough rigor within the work environment. And so ultimately, I think we want to have a place where there's radical candor. People can bring up the difficult things that need to be brought up in order to move the organization, to move the team forward.
Next question. Oh, this is a pet question a little bit. Maybe one from, perhaps from my husband, who doesn't like to talk about feelings. Does psychological safety mean we need to have a lot more conversations about people's feelings?
That gives me a bit of a chuckle. Um, you're asking the question in a little bit of a loaded way, kind of like, I think there's a right answer, or maybe you're baiting me into it. I think a short answer is yes. Yes. And if you can name the emotion in the room, put your finger on it, we don't have to talk about it for very long.
Okay.
We're not asking leaders or expecting leaders to be, therapists. Counselors. No, that's not the job. Your job is not that. Your job is to move the organization forward. And you know what? You're doing so with other human beings that have emotions. And what we often misconstrue is that we have to focus on negative emotions. And you know what? There's a lot of positive emotions out there, and it's really helpful to name them. In one particular scenario, for example, that we offer training, there's an individual talking about a project, and she's been working weekends and put this 28-page report together. And what she's really expressing is pride. She's proud of her work. And what people focus on when they reply to that particular video is they go, oh, you really shouldn't be working on weekends. If you got too much work, we'll fix that. And it's like, she doesn't care about the overtime. She's proud of her work. She's proud of the quality and the time that she's put in. She's willing to put in the weekend time to make a really great product. And to be able to name that emotion allows her to go, yeah, I am feeling proud. Awesome. Okay, thanks for acknowledging that. And let's move on, right? Like, oh, I see you're really frustrated with X. I just named the emotion. Yes, I'm frustrated. Okay, great. I get it. You're frustrated. Now let's move on. You see, like, naming it allows you to move on. And it's not just rattling around in the room, in the space, being unacknowledged. And let's face it, for example, when the pandemic first struck, I went and reached out to a colleague of mine who they have an organization of, 2,000 people or something. And so there's 500 or more managers at his fingertips. And it was about 6 weeks into the pandemic, and he reached out and just started having informal conversations with all these managers. And he said it was bimodal. There were 2 results. And I asked a very specific question. I said, how is your team doing? Half of his teams or team leaders said, oh, they are stressed to the max. I'm stressed. They're asking me questions I don't have answers to. I don't know if their jobs are going to be here, et cetera, right? There's a lot of anxiety. Then he asked the other managers. They said, how are you doing? He's like, oh, I'm totally stressed. How's your team doing? I don't know. I don't know. They didn't know. So those managers clearly are not creating an environment of psychological safety where people feel like they can express their concerns. Now, this is the beginning of the pandemic. We know it was like a colossal, holy moly, let's flip the world upside down. If you can't handle that, how effective are you as a manager to placate the feelings that are there? Now, again, we're not asking you to have people come into your office, kick their feet up, and talk about their feelings for 60 minutes. But you need to be able to at least acknowledge the emotions that are there. And sometimes there's going to be some really strong emotions, right? Especially when there's massive issues, like maybe there's been a big layoff at your organization. People have been let go. You got to address that. Otherwise, it's rattling around in the back of their brains. They're thinking, am I going to get fired next? 100%. You need to be able to address that, acknowledge that it exists. Otherwise, people are going to realize that you are totally out of tune with other humans who have feelings that are in the room. Have I made my case, Andrea?
Yeah. Yes, you did. So, from an HR perspective, we're HR professionals, providing some people not oversight, but guidance around the organizations. What can we do to influence positively psychological safety in our organizations?
Well, the first thing you could do is measure it. You should definitely do that.
Okay.
And when you measure it, you can measure it across the organization, but it is context dependent. So you can also measure it within a division or within a team.
Okay.
most people operate within more than one team.
Yeah.
And how they feel in one team might be different from another team, right? So how you feel, for example, if you're in your own team that you manage, might be totally different than how you feel when you're part of, say, a management team or a leadership team. Within that environment, you might feel a lot more anxious, or maybe you feel more. Well, I've definitely talked to leaders who feel like within their own team, they have to be a lot more careful about what they say, because they're always afraid they're going to offend people or say the wrong thing, because they have a very sarcastic manner of communicating, right? With humor. And that sarcasm is great with your buddies, but not necessarily great in a meeting environment with individuals. So the first thing you want to do is measure it. And then the second thing you want to do is facilitate a dialogue about psychological safety. I think you want to impress upon people that, hey, this is important. And psychological safety is not about holding hands and singing Kumbaya. This is about getting, what was it that you mentioned? It was honesty, caring honesty or something like that. So have a dialogue about psychological safety, what it is, what it isn't, absolutely. And if you have the results, you can just throw them in the middle of the room and say, look, we have an average score of 7 out of 10. That puts us, maybe in the top 50 percentile. And we have a really wide degree of differences here. So some people feel a high degree of psychological safety and some people feel a low. So, let's have a conversation. What might be affecting that, and create an environment where it's okay and no one's going to be judged, or, you need to set the stage there, which is really important, to impress upon people that what they have to say matters, and that there's not going to be some sort of negative consequence for them speaking up. And so you need to reframe the conversation as a means for improving as a team and for learning. We're all going to learn here. Let's learn about one another. Let's learn about how we as a team can function better and operate more effectively.
Okay, final question. There's so many resources out there about psychological safety. What are some of your favorites?
Well, the resource that first got me introduced to psychological safety is The Fearless Organization. It's a book written by Amy Edmondson. So I think it's a must read. The other one that is not directly about psychological safety, but really talks about how to operationalize it a lot more, in my opinion. And it's about defining your values and creating norms within your work environment, explicit behavior norms. Because what you want is radical candor, what you want is that sort of candid approach to communication, you need to set that tone and set the tone explicitly. In the book there is Culture Code by Dan Coyle. So it's also a really great one.
And of course, there's radical candor.
Of course. Yeah, radical candor. Yes. Kim Scott is the author. Yeah. So another great read. So those three, I think, is a really good trifecta to look at. I think Fearless Organization is a little bit more kind of high level and theoretical. And I think that's some of the criticism of it. And then I think Culture Code to operationalize some of the ideas a little bit more. And then Radical Candor is a little bit more about the interpersonal skills. So what you as an individual can do and how you show up in your day-to-day conversation. So I think those three are a really nice trifecta.
Okay. All right. Well, I will put links to those in the show notes. Thanks, Stephan. I loved how you took me to task over my comment about feelings and that pet question there. Stephan and I did another episode about executive presence, and the link to that is right here. I also referred to the episode I did about trust, and the link to that is right here. Thanks for watching out there. We will see you next time.